Okay, so we're continuing with the art history part of this course. But first, I want to talk a little bit about writing good discussion questions because a lot of people have asked me about that. Um, so, a good you can the first step in thinking about that, of course, would be to read the handout that's in the content about that. Um, and in the module about writing good discussion questions. But another way to approach it is just to think about what would happen in our discussion group on Friday if you ask that question. So if you ask a question like, how long did it take for somebody to make that? I mean, we won't be able to kick that around for 5 or 10 minutes. We could Google it and we might find the answer and we might not, but it's not something that everybody can have. Well, everybody could have a different opinion about it, but it wouldn't mean anything. If I think it took a day and you thought it took 2 days, well, we could never verify that except by research, and then that would just settle it, right? If we found the answer online somewhere. So that's not the kind of question you want. You want a question about the composition or the decisions. Why do you think the artist made that decision? With prehistoric art, like last week, there was a little more that leeway for a discussion question because there's so little that we know about um, what prehistoric art was for. For example, a question about what did the artist who made the woman of Willendorf have in mind for its purpose? That's a pretty good discussion question because we don't know. Art historians don't know. So your speculation about that is as good as anybody else's. So try to come up with a question like that where there could be a lot of different opinions about it, and they could all be kind of equally valid. If it's a question that just has an answer that you might be able to find on the internet or in a book, then that's not really a good discussion question. Also, some people have been writing discussion questions that have already been answered in the lecture. So if I talk a lot, if I answer the question, then again, it's not a very good discussion question because I've already told that information. So maybe during this lecture, if I come to a point where we could sort of talk about discussion questions, then I'll bring it up again. So another thing I want to say is at this point in the course, it becomes pretty important to start looking at the content, the online content that I added for each chapter in each module. So for example, there's 3 modules about the ancient Greeks, which we're going to talk about today. And each one of those modules has links to some videos, mostly at the Khan Academy. And those videos are pretty essential. If we have time during this lecture, we might watch 1 or 2 of them. But if you watch those videos, you'll do well on the midterm. So watch the videos, take notes from the videos, watch them more than once if you have to. Um, and the ones at the top of the content are the most important ones. So when you go to chapter 16, Ancient Greeks, part 1, there's going to be a link to this lecture, and then you'll see some links to the Khan Academy videos. And I really strongly urge you to look at those. Okay, so I'm going to go to my PowerPoint now. Okay, so again, we're starting chapter 16, which covers thousands of years. So it's going to take several lectures to get through all the content in chapter 16, unlike some of the other chapters that we could cover in one lecture. And it's really important. It sort of lays the groundwork for everything that we're going to study later in the course. So that's why we're spending more time on chapter 16. Okay, so I saw this cartoon and I just thought you might be amused by this. A lot of people in this class think that it's really weird that the amount of nudity in this class, and it's usually women, but today it's going to be nude men. So again, I can't, if that's a problem for you, I can't help it. It's just part of art history. Okay. All right, so today we're talking about the ancient Greeks. And this white area is modern day Greece, or I guess, or maybe this was just, well, this area right here is Greece. Over here is now Turkey. But actually, in the time of the ancient Greeks, and I'll get into what time that is in a minute, this was not a unified nation state that it is now. It was just a bunch of little so-called city-states. So a city-state is a separate entity with a king or a leader of some sort and its own army. And each city-state was independent. In other words, the Greeks were not united politically, but they shared a common language and culture. And at times, they did unite against common enemies, most notably the Persians. And of course, during the Trojan War, they all fought together against Troy, which is right here on the coast of what's now Greece. So, and they considered themselves, at the period we're studying, they considered themselves the superior to all the other people that lived in the Mediterranean. Okay, so where is this little country of Greece? And it actually is a very small country. Well, it's just right there. It's at the southern end of Europe. So let's just review the continents here. Here's North America, United States and Canada, South America, Africa, Asia, let me see if I can, Australia, and Europe. Okay, so a lot of the art that we study in this course is from Europe, and it begins with Greece, which is actually a pretty small part of Europe, but very important. Okay. All right, so before the slides are sort of in the wrong order here. So one of the things that we need to get straight at the beginning of the lecture is about time, basically. So BCE means before the Common Era, and CE means Common Era. Okay, so, and the year 0 is nominally the year that Jesus was born. I don't know if anybody actually knows what year that was, but it's just, now we're over here, right? In 2020, supposedly 2020 years after Jesus was born. But before the year 0, that's called the BCE, and after is called CE. Okay, so this is the first millennium BCE, the second millennium BCE, the third millennium BCE, and so on. So it's a little bit confusing because not only do we talk about a date like 563 BCE, we're going to get to Buddha in another lecture, but we also talk about centuries, and this confuses people sometimes. So the first 100 years before the birth of Jesus is the first century BCE. The second 100 years before the birth of Jesus is the second century, and so on. So if Buddha was born in 563 BCE, he was born in the 6th century BCE. So that comes up when we're talking about the ancient Greeks also. Sometimes the art historians will say during the 5th century BCE and so on. Okay, so, all right, so the periods that we're going to talk about, you can sort of ignore the geometric period. I mean, it's interesting, but we're not going to talk about it. We're going to be talking mainly about sculpture. So, and beginning with what's called the archaic period. So that runs from most of the 7th century and most of the 6th century BCE. And then the classical period, the age of Pericles, begins in the 5th century, continues in the 4th century, and a little bit into the 3rd century. And then the Hellenistic period is the longest period that lasts almost 300 years. So these are the 3 periods that you need to get straight. And we're going to talk about the stylistic differences between the archaic period sculpture, the classical period sculpture, and the Hellenistic period sculpture, but that'll take 2 lectures this week. Okay. All right, so let's go back to this Egyptian slide, which is out of order a little bit. So during the last lecture about ancient art, we looked at this amazing sculpture. And I was saying then that the Egyptian sculpture stayed the same for thousands of years, and there were certain rules about it. First of all, it was almost solely about pharaohs, kings, queens, people like that. Regular people were not usually represented in these sculptures. And when you represented the pharaoh, you had to represent him in a certain way. That is, with his left foot forward, his arms down by his side, tightly clenched, with wearing this little kilt, this headdress, and with an idealized body, that is a perfect body. And he was always, and maybe a queen too, they were always attached to some sort of pillar or what's called a plinth behind them, so that they were not freestanding, like a real person. They were stuck to a background of some sort, you could say. So this is, from the 3rd millennium BCE, contemporaneous with Stonehenge, that so way back here, that the Egyptians were doing this. Now the Greeks knew about this kind of sculpture, and when they finally started making representation or making sculptures of humans themselves out of stone, they pretty much copied the Egyptian model. So now we're talking about Greek sculpture, archaic Greek sculpture. So this is what's called a kouros. So a kouros is just a representation of a male youth. That's what the word kouros means. So you can see that it's quite similar in some ways to the Egyptian sculpture of the pharaoh. The left foot is forward, the arms are tightly clenched, and the fists, and down by the side of the figure. What you probably also have noticed is that there's some major differences that the Greeks have already come up with, because the Greeks were innovators. Their art changed a lot, unlike the Egyptians, who just kept it the same for thousands of years. The Greeks were inventive and innovative. Okay, so you can see they've already changed some things up. For example, this guy's nude. I mean, he's not wearing a little kilt anymore, like the pharaoh. And he's not stuck to a background. He's standing there on his own. And this is really kind of a technical feat as well as an aesthetic decision, because this stone is really heavy, and the sculptor has to figure out how to make this sculpture stand up, not attached to a pillar or a part of a building or something. And he managed to do it. He or she, probably he, because at this point the Greeks were pretty patriarchal, and women mostly had to stay home. So, and also, it's not a portrait of a king. It's an aristocratic youth. So these Kouros sculptures were used as grave markers frequently for people who died. And since the Greeks, let's go back to this map for a minute. Since the Greek world was a collection of city-states, scattered around the Aegean Sea, these city-states were often at war with each other. So there was war between Athens, and here's Athens, and Sparta is somewhere. Here's Sparta. Sparta, Tennessee is named after Sparta in Greece. So the Spartans and the Athenians were often at war with each other. And at one point, there was a war amongst all the city-states on this Peloponnese Peninsula. So there was a lot of war and a lot of death, you could say, in war. So these grave markers were erected to memorialize, somebody who had died either in a war or for some other reason. It's called the New York Kouros because the Metropolitan Museum of Art owns it. It wasn't found in New York. Obviously, it was found in Greece. Okay, so let's just, again, this slide is just, the purpose of it is to sort of compare. So the Greek Kouros is standing free. He's not attached to this plinth. He represents not a king. He's an aristocratic youth, not exactly an ordinary person, not a slave, because the Greeks had slaves, but not necessarily a king. You can also see that it's not, the Greek version is not as anatomically accurate as, I'm going to put the chat down here in case we need it. It's not as anatomically accurate as the Egyptian version. The head is way too big, for example. And it's kind of abstract. Like, I don't think anybody has a perfect triangle there where their thigh joins their abdomen, and the bottom of your rib cage is also not a perfect triangle that matches this triangle. It sort of seems like the sculptor was more concerned with symmetry and geometry than with naturalism, whereas the Egyptian sculptor not only made it an idealized but a naturalistic representation of the pharaoh, but almost in this case a portrait of Menkaure. So this is not just any, it's not just any generalized pharaoh, it's a specific one. It looks like Menkaure, it seems like. Whereas this is not a portrait, really. It's just kind of a generalized idea of a Kouros. Okay, but 50 years later, in the 6th century, let's see, or no, 50 years later, still in the 6th century, the Greeks had made a lot of progress in their understanding of anatomy, and they were very interested in that, in figuring out human anatomy and making their sculpture look more naturalistic or realistic or representational. So you can see that now, instead of this sort of geometric abstraction and sort of stiffness of this, of the New York Kouros, the Anavysos Kouros, so called because I think it was found in a part of Greece called, oh, I know what it was. They think that Anavysos was the sculptor. That's not known for sure, but it was found with some other sculptures by Anavysos, or anyway, it's attributed to him. Okay, so again, the Kouros is nude, but the head is more in proportion to the rest of the body. It's not too big like it was with the New York Kouros. The rib cage is more realistic. It's still not very realistic, but it's getting there. And just the transitions between the different limbs of the body and parts of the body are smoother. There's not these sort of abrupt transitions like here. So it seems like by 530 BCE, the Greeks had kind of figured out a little more about human anatomy and proportions. The knees, I think, are particularly interesting to look at because this is not, I mean, the Egyptians didn't really make very realistic knees either, but this just isn't how anybody's knee looks. Let's just be honest. This is more like it. And you know, the sculptors figured out the shape of the calf muscle and so on. So a lot in semesters past, people have asked me why the Greeks represented themselves nude like this. The Greeks exercised nude. So these young aristocratic youths, they spent a lot of time, you could say, in gym class. You know, they were training because they were soldiers primarily. That was part of their role as, you know, aristocratic youths. They were in the army of their town, whether it was Sparta or Athens or whatever. And so, and when they were training, throwing spears and that kind of stuff, and actually those training exercises became the basis for the original Olympic Games. And still there's some of those, like the javelin throw and things like that. So, and when they were training, they trained in the nude. To them, the male human figure was a representation of the gods. In other words, they imagined the gods in their own image. And, you know, they were proud of their bodies. They didn't have a problem with it. That the rules evidently were that as long as your foreskin covered your penis, it was okay. If it ever got out, if it ever stuck out of your foreskin, that was not okay. That meant you were drunk or something, and that was considered unseemly or not polite. But as long as your foreskin covered the head of your penis, you were dressed, kind of. So, I mean, they wore clothes, of course, and they wore armor when they were in actual wars, but when they were just exercising, they didn't wear clothes. So that's part of it. I mean, it's a big topic, but that's what I know. Okay, so you can see the more rounded quality of the Anavysos Kouros better in this slide. And just the perfect posture that these sculptures have. You know, they have this beautiful slight curve to the upper back and a pronounced curve at the bottom of the spine that's just really healthy posture. So they, contrary to what most people believe, they were painted with wax, colored wax, encaustic, in other words. And the Anavysos Kouros, you can still see traces of the painting on his hair and on his eyes. So they were painted to look very lifelike. And we'll see some slides of what art historians think they look like in a minute. But another thing to notice is this little smile. So that smile, let me see if I can write it in the chat here. That smile is called the archaic smile. And if you see a Greek sculpture with that little slight smile, then you know it's from the archaic period, the first period that we're studying of Greek sculpture. Or if you're traveling in Greece with other people and you've taken an art history course and you want to sort of explain what you're seeing to them, you can say, oh, look, this one is from the archaic period, and you can tell because it's got this little smile. So what was that little smile about? Art historians think the smile was about the afterlife, the happiness of being in the afterlife. Okay. All right, so there were also female sculptures that the ancient Greeks made. They were also painted. These are called chores. So this here it says peplos chore. Okay, so the peplos is the dress that she's wearing. That's the name of this garment, usually made out of wool, some kind of soft wool that it's basically a tube that's belted at the waist and then pinned at the shoulders, and the top sort of overlaps. So that's the peplos. A chore is just a female youth as opposed to a kouros. So this is also marble like the Anavysos Kouros. But the difference is that her arm, it seems, at some point, her left arm was forward, and nobody knows what was in that, what she was holding. It's possible she was holding, as in this reconstruction, an apple. Maybe she represented a goddess, and it's thought that she was wearing some kind of headdress because there's a little hole in the top of the head where a metal headdress could fit. A lot of times, Greek sculptures were outfitted with metal accoutrements, sort of. And she was also, analysis has showed that she was brightly painted with encaustic. So this is sort of the representation that I like the best. And if this is accurate, she probably represented a goddess, the goddess Artemis, as the Greeks called her. Maybe I should write that in the chat too. The Romans called her Diana, and she was a huntress goddess. So she's got, she probably originally had a bow. If this is it, what she is, she would have had a bow in her left hand and an arrow in her right hand, and this incredible kind of crown that she's wearing. So you can see that, it's not clear exactly, what color. Some people think the dress was painted like this, some people like this, but there were animals on the front panel of the dress, which also suggests it might be Artemis, who was a sort of protector of animals as well as a hunter of wild animals. Okay, so now we're moving on to the late Archaic, early Classical period. And this is the 5th century BCE. So, yeah. So you can, there's some important differences already. Now, one question that's come up repeatedly is, why did they make him with no arms and only one leg? Well, they didn't. Okay, it's broken. It was discovered like this, and so it's likely that it's certain that he had 2 arms and 2 legs, but there were a lot of disasters that happened in Athens, including the Persians coming to Athens and basically burning it to the ground. And then this sculpture was buried to protect it from the Persians, but at some point it lost its 2 arms and legs. So this isn't intentional. This is just an accident. But you can see that now the Greeks have pretty much mastered human anatomy. This is very naturalistic. The rib cage is not this sort of weird triangle. The joint, the passage between the thigh and the hip is more naturalistic. And the figure stands in a pose that's called Contrapposto. So Contrapposto, that's an Italian, oops, I misspelled it, sorry. I think I'm spelling it right now. Maybe there's another S in there. Anyway, yeah, I think there is. Let's get it right. Okay, that looks right. That's an Italian word that it's Italian because in the Italian Renaissance, the sculptors like Michelangelo copied this contrapposto pose. Okay, so what is contrapposto? Contrapposto is a much more natural way of standing than this rigid posture that the New York Kouros had, or even that the Anavysos Kouros had. Because when you're standing, usually your weight is on one leg, in this case the left leg, and your right leg might be slightly bent or loose. You're not standing rigidly frontal. It's hard to see here, but he's looking slightly to one side. This shoulder is slightly lower than this shoulder, as happens when you're standing with your weight mainly on the left foot. So I think the best way to understand this is to watch the video. So we're going to go to the video now. I'm going to stop the slideshow for a minute. And we're going to quickly watch the Critios Boy video, which explains all this beautifully. So I hope this works.
We're in the New Acropolis Museum in Athens, looking at the Critios Boy.
We're in the very late Archaic period. Some call this the severe style. We might even call this early classical.
It's really this transition between the late Archaic and the early classical, and the sculpture is such a great embodiment of that.
It allows us to see the transition between the Archaic Kouros and the much more naturalistic movement-filled figures that we find on the Parthenon, for example, in the frieze or in the metopes.
This sculpture was probably broken originally when the Persians invaded Athens and desecrated the Acropolis. This was a huge blow to the Greeks, and when they finally recovered this territory, they took the sculptures that had been destroyed and they buried them. So it's ironic that the reason that these sculptures are preserved is in part because they were destroyed. But to make the story even more complicated, before the Greeks had been defeated by the Persians, they had an earlier victory at Marathon,
where an overwhelming force of Persians was defeated.
Now that first victory by the Greeks over the Persians is important to understand in relationship to this sculpture, because some art historians have suggested that the newfound naturalism that we see in the sculpture is a result of the new sense of self, the new sense of self-determination that came in the wake of the victory over the Persians.
And a sense of Athens as the leader among the Greek city-states who united against the Persians.
So like the earlier Kouros figures, this is marble. It's a standing nude. He's relatively still, although there is this potential for movement.
So with the Kouros figures, you had a figure that was both standing still and moving simultaneously. But here we have incipient movement about to take place. We have a sense of process. And I think it's that unfolding of time that makes this figure seem so much a part of our world instead of the timeless world of the Kouros.
Well, the Kouros figures were depicted as stick figures. There were mechanical joints that were suggested but did not really exist.
Didn't really work.
Well, that's right. There was no way for those figures to actually move. Whereas this figure, the much more naturalistic renderings of the volumes of the body, the understanding of the musculature, the understanding of the bone structure, and especially the transitions from one part of the body to the next, make the potential for movement believable.
Although we don't see the feet and the right side, we don't see the calf, there is a sense that this figure is standing in a pose that art historians call contrapposto. That is, his weight is shifted onto one leg, and here's the important part. As a result, other things happen within the body, so that one shift in one part of the body affects the rest of the body. So the body acts in unison.
We can see that very clearly with the knees. The weight-bearing knee is higher than the free leg knee, and that's because that knee droops down a little bit. The axes of the hips are no longer aligned. The weight-bearing leg has a hip that juts upward into the torso, where the free leg, the hip hangs down.
The shoulder above the weight-bearing leg actually drops down slightly, and that compresses the torso in between. His lifelikeness is carried into the head, which shifts a little bit, so we don't have that strict frontality that we saw in the Kouroi. The symmetry of the body is broken. In actuality, human beings are never symmetrical, right? Our bodies move and shift.
That's why the Kouroi seems so artificial.
Exactly, they seem transparent. transcendent and timeless, but because the Critias boy is asymmetrical, we have a sense of his engagement with the world. Gone is that archaic smile that seems to transcend reality. But one of the really interesting things about the Critias boy is if we look from the side, we see an arch in his back, and there's a sense that he's moving forward and holding himself back at the same time. He's a bit of a tease.
Well, he's in a very relaxed pose.
We should mention that the Greeks had started to make bronze sculptures just before this, and bronze allowed artists to create sculptures with limbs more separated from the torso, or limbs lifted into space.
And you can see why that could be tricky in marble. In fact, this figure has lost its leg and it's lost its arms. On his left hip, you can still see a fragment of the strut or bridge that would have helped support the arm that would have been next to it. That also lets us know that the arm really was at his sides, very much like a traditional kouros.
So we see the desire on the part of the Greeks, on the part of this artist, to create a sculpture that's more open, where the limbs and the torso are more separated from one another. But in marble, that's really hard to do.
One more point about the interest in bronze. Unlike so much marble sculpture, here we have eyes that have been hollowed out. They would have been inset probably with glass paste eyes that would have been very lifelike, and that's a technique that was commonly used in bronze. In traditional marble sculptures, you actually have the eyes part of the solid piece of marble, and they would have just been painted. There is this interesting reference to the technique of bronze casting, even here in a marble sculpture. And I should mention that the reason we call it the Critias boy is because the Critias sculptor was an important sculptor in bronze at this time, of which this is very stylistically similar. In the entire body, we've moved away from the linear representation of symbols of the body, and we now have these smooth, beautiful volumes that represent this Greek ideal of the athletic male youth.
That represented the peak of human achievement and also the qualities of the divine.
Okay, so there's a lot of information in that video, and let's go back to the slideshow and kind of review what they said. But you should also watch that video again and take some notes from it. The midterm will be an open source test, but your own notes are going to be invaluable. So rather than spend a lot of time searching for the information you need to write the answer, it's going to be an essay style test with several questions, maybe 5 or 6 questions that you'll write a short essay in response to. I really recommend that you make notes from the lectures and from the videos that you can refer to when you're doing the midterm test. Okay, so let's just kind of review what the art historian said in that video about the Critias boy. They compared it to the earlier Kouros figure, mainly the New York Kouros, and implicitly the Anavysos Kouros, and pointed out that the archaic smile is gone. This is sort of the end of the archaic period and the beginning of the classical period. So, and there's other stylistic differences. He's in a much more natural pose. He's not as stiff as those earlier Kouroses. Kouroi. His head is turned slightly to one side. He's not as strictly frontal. His joints look more real, like he could actually move. And there's hollow places where he once had glass paste eyes, like a bronze sculpture would have had, which probably made him look very naturalistic. Okay, here's some other slides. So you can see here the slight turn of the head to his own right. And the struts that they mentioned, where his arms were almost certainly once attached, but they've fallen off because there was a lot of stuff going on, notably the Persians. Okay, so this is a sort of a model of how they think Greek sculptures were painted. I mean, it almost looks gaudy to us, like maybe not in good taste or something, because we're so used to thinking of Greek sculptures as these pristine white marbles, but they really were not. They were brightly painted, so that and they were often mounted on um, a temple pediment, which we'll get to in the next lecture. So you know, to see them from a distance, they kind of had to be brightly painted. This represents, people think this was not from the Parthenon, from another Greek temple, and they think that it was meant to be a portrait of a character in the Iliad, which is about the Trojan War, and this character was called Paris. He was the person who abducted Helena and took her to Troy. Okay, so you've seen this sculpture before. We talked about it when we were talking about uh, idealized naturalism, I think, in this second lecture. But this is more or less contemporaneous with the Critios boy sculpture that we just looked at, made around the same time, but it's made not of marble, it's made of bronze. So the Greeks had by this time perfected sculpture in bronze, which is pretty technologically demanding in that it's cast bronze, that is, liquid bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, is poured into a mold, and then the mold is removed, and you know, the sculpture, once it cools and hardens, is there for pretty much eternity, unless somebody melts it down and makes it into spears and arrows and stuff. Because bronze was also the material that the Greeks made weaponry out of. In fact, the period before, um, leading up to the Archaic period and the early Classical period, was called the Bronze Age because of the proliferation of bronze tools and weapons in the ancient world. So a lot of bronze sculptures were eventually melted down and turned into tools or weapons, and that's why there are not that many of them that have survived. But this one, um, like a lot of the bronze sculptures that did survive, was fell off a shipwreck. It was in a shipwreck, so it ended up at the bottom of the ocean and was eventually recovered, you know, in modern times in pretty good shape. So you can see that the sculpture in bronze opens up all sorts of possibilities that are impossible in marble, or difficult anyway. The figures could extend their arms in a way that a marble sculpture could not very easily do. You could even make, you know, the reins of your horse out of bronze. So this was part of a bigger sort of sculptural program that involved a chariot, 3 or 4 horses, a groom. Let me see if I've got a slide of that. Yeah, 4 horses, a chariot, the charioteer, the reins going to all 4 horses, and then an extra horse with a groom. So expensive, ostentatious, fancy, and all, as we learned earlier, was part of a gift to the god Apollo on the island of Delphi. So, but this is the surviving part of it, plus some of the horse's legs here. So, let me see if there's a slide of the head. Yeah, okay, so in bronze sculpture, the sculptor could make leave a cavity there. So bronze is not, it's not solid bronze. It's, if you banged on it, you would hear dong, dong, dong. So it's hollow on the inside. And the eyes could be fitted with these paste or glass-like eyes, and even little metal eyelashes you can see here, copper, made out of copper. And then art historians think that the headband probably was inlaid with silver. So it was very fancy, very expensive, very beautiful thing that somehow ended up on the bottom of the ocean. Who knows how? But that's why we still can look at it, so it's a good thing. All right, so here's another one that ended up on the bottom of the ocean, a fantastically well preserved bronze from the early classical period. So this is 20 years later. And this is just so impressive. I think it's almost as if the sculptor was showing off his ability, what you could do with bronze. That is, the arms didn't have to be rigidly down by the side of the figure anymore. They could be extended in space. The legs could be extended in space. And we don't really know what this is supposed to represent, but it's probably the god Zeus throwing a thunderbolt. So, and it's big, bigger than life size. So now, again, we're going to go to a short video about this incredible thing. So one of the advantages of video for sculpture is that you can virtually walk around the sculpture. So sculpture is three-dimensional, right? So you want to see it in the round, not just in a flat slide. And that's another reason that you should watch the videos, because it's more like actually being in a museum with the sculpture where you can see it. So let me just find it here. All right, here we go. All right.
We're in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and we're looking at a great bronze sculpture of a striding god.
You didn't even have to tell me it was a god. He's so powerful. He looks so in control. We look at him and we know that this is a god who controls the fates of human beings.
We're pretty sure he's either Poseidon or Zeus.
Now, Poseidon's the god of the sea.
And his brother, Zeus, is the god who rules all of the Olympian gods from Mount Olympus. And the way that we would be able to determine which it was is dependent on what he was holding.
If he was holding a trident, he would be Poseidon, and if he was holding a thunderbolt, he would be Zeus. Now, sadly, his attribute is lost.
Most art historians tend to think it's Zeus. A thunderbolt was short, and it would not have obscured the face the way that a trident would have, which was much longer. In addition, if you look at the gap in his hand, it's a wide grasp, much wider than it would be if it was the narrow handle of a trident.
A thunderbolt was Zeus's weapon of choice. He's referred to as the hurler of thunderbolts. Now, this is bronze. It's important to talk about what this would have looked like in 460 BCE when it was created. It would have gleamed, it would have shined in the light.
It's so rare that we have an original Greek bronze. And the only reason we have this one is that it was recovered from an ancient shipwreck. What happens is the bronze doesn't rust unless there is air and water that alternate. So underwater it gets encrusted with lots of barnacles and sea creatures, but it actually can be quite well preserved, as is the case here.
So that gleaming, shining, radiant effect goes with the idea of this being Zeus.
Especially since we think that the eyebrows, perhaps the beard, and certainly the thunderbolt would have been inlaid with silver, and so you would have had that gleaming, warm color of the bronze against those brilliant flashes of silver.
His eyes would have been inlaid with glass, and so you have this amazing figure not only gleaming but also striding toward us, depending on where we stand, of course.
Well, look at the way he occupies space. We don't want to stand in front of him. We would be the victim of that thunderbolt. His focus is extraordinary. We have that incredible extension that is more than 6 feet of one hand to the other, and he's steadying himself but also aiming with that hand before him.
He's shifting as you would need to do in order to hurl something like a thunderbolt, although it's hard to imagine hurling a thunderbolt.
Well, that's right. He's pushing off with his right leg, and his left leg, the toes are up as if that foot is readying itself to bear the weight of the body as he steps forward.
Now, if you think back just 100 years to the Archaic period, Greek sculptors were making sculptures out of marble, and they were very contained. That is, the limbs were close to the body. We see during this early classical period,
sometimes known as the severe style.
an interest in figures that are more open, where you have limbs that are apart, figures that move into the space of the viewer, and this is possible because of the use of bronze.
We don't need the struts, we don't need the bridges that are required in a marble sculpture. Here, the tensile strength of the bronze is great enough so that those arms can be out and give that kind of extraordinary vitality to this figure and invite us to walk around it.
There are really three distinct views of this sculpture. The front and the back make the figure look very flat, very schematic, very silhouetted. We see the full body, we see both legs, the torso.
It's almost like a drawing.
The arms stretched out.
And the arms, especially the left arm, are a little longer than they would be naturally.
But when we move to the side, that sense of flatness changes, and we get a figure that seems to occupy space in all directions.
We see the depth of the torso, we can see a little bit of a twist in the hips and the upper body, and so we see this figure breaking out from that Kouros tradition dramatically.
And so what seems like silhouette actually exists in depth.
And look, for instance, at the angle of the hole in the right hand. We can see that the thunderbolt, or the trident, was not held parallel with the hand, but would have swung around because it's at a little bit of an angle.
The remarkable thing to me is that he looks powerful, he looks superhuman, but still human in his nudity.
The Greeks, understanding the male human body as this receptacle for all of its ideals. Plato talked about the idea that the gods were the perfect manifestation and that we were a kind of inferior reflection of that perfection. And so here we see the Greeks setting up this idealized human male body, and we are just a reflection of that.
Okay, so I've got, as you can see, I misspelled Contrapposto all 3 times. All right, so I'm going to get it right this time. Contra, 2 P's. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to go. All right, so now one more slide. Just because it's cool. All right, so this is a sort of a reconstruction. There were also some other bronzes discovered from around this time, and I'm showing this slide because this is how they would have looked when they were brand spanking new, right? The Artemisian Zeus and the Charioteer are both, you know, they were underwater for a long time, and they're beautiful, but they're aged by their 1,000 years or so they spent underwater. But this was the goal. Okay, this is what they would have looked like new, and you can see how lifelike the Greek bronzes must have been. So these represent 2 kings, the Thracian king on your right and the Greek king on your left. Now, when I first saw this, I laughed out loud because this ridiculous hat. It looked like a gerbil or something, but it's actually supposed to be a silver fox. So this particular king could be identified by his fur hat that was made out of a silver fox, allegedly. And then the Greek king by his helmet and so on. So you can see also the armor and the arms that these guys used. They used these really long bronze spears. They had to carry these shields, and I don't know what he's got, an axe of some sort. And, you know, in a real war, like in the Trojan War, they also wore armor. So all of that stuff was heavy. I think about that every time I use my rock bar, which probably weighs about 25 pounds. I've sort of wondered how much these spears weigh. I think they weighed a little bit less, but still, throwing that, you know, with accuracy at somebody else would take a lot of strength. So, yeah, so that's the sort of idealized version of the Greek male that became also the Greek god, as one of the art historians says, the receptacle for all their ideas about what was divine and what was good are illustrated here in these male figures. But don't worry, we're going to see some sculptures of amazing women too next time, notably the goddess Athena. Okay, so that's pretty much all for today. So, any questions from the people that are here about the course or just the lecture today? Okay, so I will see you again on Wednesday, and we'll continue with this um, study of the ancient Greeks and their amazing sculpture.